All right. Well, hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us and joining today's GP Strategies webinar. My name is Kayla Rotz, Marketing Manager for GP Strategies, and I'm very happy to be your host for today's event. If you joined us before, we are very glad to have you back, and if this is your first session with us, well, a big welcome goes out to you. I'd like to introduce you to today's presenter, Leah Clark. Leah leads strategy and planning for Blessing White, focusing on bringing new products to market and enhancing the participant experience. She conducts research and writes articles and blogs on leadership on behalf of GP Strategies, and she also works directly with our clients to understand their leadership and engagement challenges and consult with them on creative solutions. So Leah, thank you so much for joining us. We're happy to have you here, and I'm going to go ahead and turn the session over to you.
Great. Thank you, Kayla. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining from. Welcome to the webinar, Steady Communication During Unsteady Times. And I know for a lot of us, days that have already been cluttered with a lot to do have become even more increasingly filled with the need to juggle priorities, homebound children, concerns for loved ones. So I appreciate very much the time that you're carving out to be on this webinar today. And in a few moments, I am going to segue into the topic of leadership communication. But before I do that, I wanted to take a minute and acknowledge just how many lives have been lost to COVID. And I thought about doing a moment of silence, but I recognize that a lot of people are still dialing in, and it could be confusing if you hear a stretch of silence now. But I just felt I would be remiss if I didn't recognize the personal sacrifice that so many have gone through in the past few months, including first responders who are leaders themselves on the front line of what is a terrible situation. So please, if not now, maybe at some point today, just stop for a moment and recognize that this really has been such a loss for so many in terms of the human tragedy associated with the COVID challenge. You know, and I appreciate the chance to talk about what it means to be a leader during unsteady times. I recognize that the interest in this topic is absolutely connected to something very profound that's happening in our larger global community. Before we jump into communication, I wanted to set the stage and recognize that the challenge in front of our leaders is how to communicate effectively during this incredible time of uncertainty. Uncertainty certainly in the medical community, the business community, our schools. And a month ago, maybe a little bit more, we were talking about this topic of leadership and change, what it means to lead in a volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous world. And I was commenting to some of my colleagues that that type of change seems almost cute by comparison to what leaders are dealing with today. Because we're not talking about how to communicate during periods of strategic change. We're talking about communicating during times of incredible uncertainty. And there's a difference. I recognize that uncertainty can be an element of change, so they're not mutually exclusive. We know that change is constant, right? Organizations and markets will evolve. There's some ability to anticipate those changes or project. Uncertainty brings a shorter time frame, and it feels, I think, way more uncomfortable because we lack clarity around what's next. It brings greater anxiety and stress. We can sometimes plan change, right? So take actions that are longer term and strategic. Uncertainty requires much more immediate decision making. Right now, jobs are being lost or furloughed. Individuals can't be with loved ones, and there's so much that is unknown, not just about what we're dealing with today, but certainly, where are we headed after all of this? So there's tremendous vulnerability in the type of uncertainty that leaders are dealing with right now. And while we can talk about the fact that ultimately part of evolving as a leader is to be more agile, right? To gain greater comfort with ambiguity and to flex with it. But a more typical reaction to uncertainty is not agility, but a bit of a paralysis or an inability to move forward. Another important distinction that I want to make before we jump too much further is that I'm not talking about crisis communication here. Crisis communication demands very clear action. With crisis, leaders know what they need to do, right? The patient is on the table, the house is burning, and the way you need to communicate for results and the steps you need to take, they're pretty clear. And it's okay in those situations to be a little bit more directive And communicating action is easier because you know pretty much what needs to happen. But what leaders are facing today is this in between place. They don't have the benefit necessarily of strategy or planning or maybe that slightly longer term view. They're not in that immediate crisis necessarily unless they're in medical profession or on the front lines. The leaders in business that many of us are dealing with, they're in this place again of uncertainty. The conditions are rough. They're in uncharted waters, and it's unclear when things will get calm again. New global conditions, health concerns, economic concerns. So when we'll return to business as usual or what that even means anymore is unclear. It's uncertain. And when those situations are uncertain, we're wired to make actually less rational decisions. To me, this is counterintuitive, but in fact, it's true. So the less information we have, I would think, the more careful and rational we would be as individuals and human beings in evaluating the validity of whatever information is coming into us. But when uncertainty of situations increase, our brains yield to emotions like anxiety and fear. And that's a lot of what's going on with our leaders today. There can be this feeling of disorientation and a loss of control. And when things are unfamiliar and uncertain, responses are more improvised. But as leaders, if you can learn how to quiet that system in yourself and help others do the same, you can give more space for those rational choices to be made and for strong communication to emerge. So that ultimately, as a leader, it's important to first gain some control of your own thoughts, to quiet that system and bring some balance to yourself as a human being. So you can then turn your attention and your communication to those you lead and communicate in a steady way, again, during these times that are unsteady. So it's about gaining back a little bit of what some might call executive presence. And among all of the tools at your disposal, the most powerful tool you have is effective communication. So I want to spend the rest of this session talking about how you can communicate effectively. I think it's pretty appropriate that the image we chose here was a leader leading in a virtual and remote way, right? Because that's our reality right now. So let's talk a little bit about how you can communicate in a steady way for unsteady times. I'm going to focus the rest of this discussion, the next 20, 30 minutes or so that we have, around how we can communicate using this very simple framework of competence and connection to describe how, as leaders, you can express confidence and also take care of your people by communicating effectively. And it's a framework that was developed by author and thought leader Terry Pierce, who wrote about authentic leadership communication. And the fact is that leaders need both competence and connection to get the job done. And they need to convey both, particularly during times of uncertainty. So you can think about competence as your skills, your knowledge, your ability as a leader. People want to be led by someone they know is going to be successful. They want to be led by somebody competent. And I always say, my colleagues are probably a little tired of hearing me say this, but competence gets you that seat at the table of leadership. But it's connection that really separates great leaders from those who are merely good. Connection is about how you establish lasting relationships with people, how you create trust, demonstrate authenticity. If we really want to be great leaders, we need to connect with others. Now more than ever, I believe that people are looking for that connection with their leaders and certainly with each other. So let's break these two apart. We'll unpack the elements of each, identify some specific tips for effective communication, and then I'll illustrate with some examples that are, I think, very relevant given what we see going on certainly in the world today. So communicating for competence, let's start there. This is about being that steady force during unsteady times. And it can be hard when, as a leader, you're dealing with your own emotions and your own personal challenges. But part of the job of being a leader is to be that steady hand that helps to guide others. McKinsey recently released an article on leadership in crisis. It's excellent. I'll share the reference at the end. And among other things that they highlighted was the need for leaders to have what they called deliberate calm. They described it as a detachment from the crisis that allows them to think more clearly about how to navigate it. This is not about being robotic because, as I'll talk about later in this session, there is this need to connect with others in a meaningful way. But deliberate calm is about how to stay level-headed during this time of uncertainty. So you can act with urgency without being crazed. Staying level-headed and demonstrating competence in your messaging means first, communicating with clarity, being specific and transparent, sharing what you know honestly, being straightforward, being clear. It also means share what you don't know. Addressing that unknown is almost as important as sharing what you are doing. If there's information that you don't have, state that simply and plainly. Because let's face it, and I think most of us know this, your team, your employees, they'll be able to discern when you're not being forthcoming. Be clear on what you need your people to do, articulate what you want them to focus on, maybe let them know how things have been reprioritized in light of everything that's going on. Help them feel secure that you have the knowledge of what needs to get done. So what does this look like? I told you I would give you some examples in addition to the tips being shared here. And I know I'm going to immediately go out on a limb by providing an example of a political figure. But please, before you start jumping in the chat, know that I'll provide examples from both sides of the aisle. And what I want you to focus on more is the clarity of the communication. Look at this analytically in terms of communication for competence, not so much what you think of the individual. So here goes, clarity. Be transparent and specific. Share what you know and what you don't. So you might not agree with his politics or even his approach, but what I want you to focus on, or what I want to highlight, is Cuomo's ability to say very clearly what he knows and what he doesn't. Right? Everyone wants to know one thing. When will it end? Nobody knows. We're dealing with a war we've never dealt with before. He's not mincing words, and his words, while not overly harsh, they're clear. He's careful also not to take an overly upbeat tone, and given the nature of the crisis, I think this would ring untrue and certainly come across as tone deaf. His communications are thoughtful, frequent, he's transparent about what he knows and what he doesn't. Republican Larry Hogan of Maryland, another leader who has been very vocal, very level-headed and clear in his communication. This is going to be much harder, take much longer, and be much worse than anyone is understanding. Both leaders have been in front of their people as their job demands and are clear in what they know and what they don't. And your people are looking for the same from you. It might sound something like this in the business world. Here's how our business has been impacted, and this is what we need to do. We don't know what additional changes we'll need to make to respond to decreased sales, business losses, but here's what we know right now, and here's what we're going to do. Be as clear as you can be. And then move quickly. Communicate with urgency. This is about getting messages to your employees quickly. And as a leader, you may not have all the information you want, but communicating early and often about what you do know and what actions you have taken helps people avoid catastrophizing. So share as much as you can as soon as you can. Long gaps of silence and information dressed up as something other than the truth are more harmful than beneficial. You should certainly restate what needs to get done or reprioritize. Set clear priorities for how you need your teams to respond and then empower them to execute against that solution. Where do you need to focus them right away? Let them know, then get to work and let them do the same. Be prepared to make and communicate decisions, again, even in the absence of complete information. Long gaps of silence will make people nervous. They'll start to wonder what's happening to them. Is their job at risk? What's going to happen next with my company? So communicate with urgency so they feel informed. And when you do, it's more likely that your people will spend time being engaged and less time wondering about the steadfastness of their job. So what has this looked like recently? So many leaders have had to communicate with urgency and then follow up that urgency with urgent action. You can look at the governors of California and Ohio who took action to communicate and start to lock down their states in March 19th and 22nd, respectively. And I know that doesn't seem like a long time ago, but I think we have to start measuring things in COVID years or COVID days, and it feels like an eternity. Certainly, they were early in their communication, they had that urgency. And neither one of them had complete information, they still don't. But they had enough information to communicate with urgency and take those urgent actions. Whether or not they ultimately saved lives, I think, is something that's going to be studied and analyzed. But the point is, they expressed confidence through the urgency with which they acted. And then I'll just point also to the leader of Taiwan. She, in fact, acted with urgency back in January, introducing 124 measures to stop the spread. And right now, she is sending 10 million face masks to the US and to Europe. Communicating with competence means expressing confidence, being clear and decisive, using language that is direct and specific. Share the most critical information and not more than you need to. I'm not saying in that statement to be untruthful about a situation. I'm just saying take a measured approach to how you share the information and do so in a way that doesn't stoke fear or anxiety. Pay attention to the details of your communication, including being highly intentional about your word choice, right? So now's not the time to stumble over a poorly timed metaphor about the Titanic, right? Be very clear and thoughtful in the words that you're using and the examples you're giving. I want to point out an important distinction here, which is to say that communicating with confidence is not about being Pollyanna in your communication, because in fact, over communicating or overconfidence can in fact decrease trust. For those of you who have read the book Good to Great, Jim Collins covers the example of General Stockdale and the Stockdale paradox, which I think illustrates this point in a really interesting way. So General James Stockdale was a Vietnam veteran who spent 7 years as a prisoner of war, and he was tortured many times over. Ultimately, he made it out. And when he was asked who didn't make it out, his answer, the optimist. He attributed his own ability to survive to a blend of hard pragmatism combined with unwavering hope for the future. The Stockdale paradox emphasized that the most likely to triumph are those who can have confidence without the risk of promising something, even to themselves, that can't be promised. And then McKinsey, again, this article that I would highly recommend reading suggests something similar. What they advocate for is the concept of bounded optimism. So the ability to express confidence combined with realism. Early in a crisis, what they say is if a leader displays too much confidence, they can lose credibility. So it's more effective to project confidence that the organization will find a way through the tough situation, but recognize the uncertainty that you're dealing with. So examples here. Angela Merkel's language and actions, a great example of clarity and decisiveness that inspires confidence. And earlier this year in a televised address, she was abundantly clear. This is serious, take it seriously. It was evident in her words, her approach was matter-of-fact and calm, and she used reason and not emotion here to create a compelling message. Another example, Dr. Fauci. He has the credentials, the experience, the expertise. He checks the box in terms of competence based on those credentials. But what I want you to focus on here again is his expression of confidence in his communication. He's clear and decisive in his language. Even when he's admittedly unsure he's making the right decision, his word choice and his tone are impactful, right? We don't set the timeline, the virus sets the timeline. And when he does talk about a potential solution, he is confident, but again, not overpromising. He suggests that the vaccine will get there over time, but he doesn't promise a full eradication. So express confidence by being direct and talking about how you will approach organizational challenges. Express that confidence to the people that you lead. And then finally, consistency. As a leader, people are watching you and your leadership peers. It's important to align your tone and your word choice with the essence of your message. Before you make a commitment, be certain you can follow through on it. Don't overpromise something that you are not able to deliver. Because if your communication and your follow-up actions are consistent, you'll be perceived as a strong and trusted leader. And I would even suggest here, get some coaching on this. You do have in a situation like this where it's not crisis, where it's not long-term strategic change, you have half a beat to stop and be intentional about the way you communicate. So ask a trusted colleague, how am I coming across? Where am I unclear? Is my tone, are my words aligned with what I'm trying to say? So consistency. Again, examples really pulled from what we're seeing right now. The mayor of Philadelphia and the governor of New Jersey, I think, did a great job demonstrating consistency in thought and action. In Philadelphia, Mayor Kenny strongly encouraged people to stay home and, among other best practices, to get some exercise. At the same time, he closed MLK Drive, which is a major thoroughfare into the city, so that people could use it to exercise. And until recently, most New Jersey parks remained opened, although playgrounds and recreational spaces were locked down. And I know this is changing almost day to day. In New Jersey, too, the state is finding and arresting individuals who are, yes, hosting coronavirus parties, including in towns not too far away from me. So these leaders and their messages were clear and their actions were consistent. So as leaders yourselves, what might you be saying to your people and how can you be consistent in your words and your actions? So think about it like this. You are saying to your people things like, your safety is important to us. Here's what we're doing. And when you say that, then back that up, as many are doing, with the measures that you need to put in place to help them be safe and be productive from home. Okay, so we've talked about competence up until now, but I want to switch gears and talk about the other side of the equation when it comes to communication, that connection side. And while your people are looking for you to communicate with and for both competence and connection, as I said, it's really about both. It's the connection side that leaders often struggle the most with. So according to research done by Harris Polls, most leaders rate high in competence. Again, that's how they got promoted often, their accomplishments, their knowledge, their experience. And when asked to rate themselves on connection, as you can see, 93% of them 93% rated themselves very effective or somewhat effective. But look at how frontline and middle managers rated those same leaders. This shows that there's often a major discrepancy between how we perceive ourselves as leaders and how people we lead perceive us. So how can we better connect with those we lead? What do we need to do to connect with them and engage them more fully? Okay, so what I want to ask you to do is to use the chat, and if you could respond to this simple question or prompt. Think of a leader that you willingly followed. And that leader can come from business. It might be somebody that you interacted with as you were growing up and playing sports. But think of a leader that you willingly followed. What about them made you want to follow them? So if you could just put a couple of words, think about a leader you willingly followed. And if you could put a few words in the chat that answered the question, what made you want to follow them? They cared, their humility, honesty, authenticity. He was real, trustworthiness, respect for me, authenticity, there it is again, knowledgeable and cared, honesty. Gosh, look at how much honesty comes up, right? This is great. Thank you. Please keep them coming in. Even as I continue, it would be great for your colleagues on the phone to see what comes up. And most of the time when we ask this question, we hear what you've put in the chat. We hear words of connection. Rarely does anyone say she had incredible experience or his industry knowledge was unparalleled. We see things like what you're putting in here. I trusted her. She had my back. We see comments associated with that leader's ability to connect. That's what you've all named here in that chat. And yet most leaders have a blind spot when it comes to how well they connect with others. It's important when leading individuals regularly and even more so during times of crisis. So let's dig into what we can do and what we mean by connection. And thank you for all of the comments that you put in the chat. Certainly you're lending to the support for this model. Okay, so connection. Communicating for connection is really about forging strong relationships, not just having the answers. Communicate from a place of shared humanity and with humility. And that includes empathy, first and foremost. As a leader, especially with what's going on right now, put yourselves in the shoes of the people you're talking to. What might they be feeling right now, and how can you acknowledge those emotions? So check in with your people to understand where they're coming from on a personal level. Ask them how they're doing, and then listen actively. So this is not about an obligatory, how are you? And then phoning it in as they respond. It's really about asking that question and then keenly tuning in to what your employee is saying or what you're seeing come across in the video chat, in their body language, their tone. I think this might be the single most important element of your communication during times that are unsteady. And I would also add, certainly as a leader, be open to empathy from others. So who or what are my examples here? I think it's a fascinating article that Forbes just published 2 days ago, looking at countries where female leaders and how they responded, looking at countries where female leaders are in charge and noting how they responded to the coronavirus crisis. And I saw an interview with the author, and she noted two things in the way these female leaders conducted themselves. She said compassion and rigor. Compassion and rigor. And I think a lot of that phrase connects to what we're talking about here, the competence and the connection. And yes, they were out in front being decisive and proactive. What she called out in particular was their ability to express empathy. They're certainly tough and they take the tough actions, but they're able to connect with the people that they lead. Fantastic article. Highly recommend that you read this if you are interested in learning a little bit more. I wanted to give you another example. And look, I promised at the beginning I was going to go less controversial as my examples went on. And I don't think there's anything less controversial, for me at least, than Mr. Rogers. So those of you who have grown up on him might know he's really the ultimate example of someone who had an incredible gift to express empathy, kindness, compassion, not grandiose gestures. And we are probably all seeing this. I'm seeing this pop up in the way we interact with each other and with our communities, right? These small gestures, starting conference calls with personal check-ins on others' well-being. I can see it in the way local teachers have found ways to reach out to my children and interact with them, virtually or through a drive-by parade when they can't be with them in the classroom. It's the way that people are donating food to local first responders or those shopping angels who are helping the elderly shop for their groceries when they can't get in the stores. It's, again, what is emphasized here by Fred Rogers is deep and simple. Okay, connection, authenticity. A few of you mentioned this in the chat. Communicating for connection involves authenticity. How, as a leader, you can be true to who you are and share that with others. So in difficult times, people will follow you if they believe your message is authentic. And your teams need to trust you, not because of your title, but because of who you are as a person. So let them see your strengths and your flaws. And when you do, they'll be more willing to rally around you. Give them insight into what the authors Goffey and Jones called your allowable weaknesses. You're not perfect as a leader or a human being. It's okay to share your flaws and acknowledge them and to ask for help. Another thing that you can do here is certainly be consistent in how you express yourself, both in your prepared remarks and in responding to questions. So if people see a different version of you when you're not scripted, they'll really question who the real you is. So on script and off script, be the same person. And while it's hard for me to keep track of all of the chat that's going on, I did see someone bring up the point that I want to make on this right now, which is this requires great self-awareness. It was mentioned when I talked about authenticity, about empathy, and it certainly is relevant here. And that self-awareness is not something that's likely to just pop up during a crisis. So it's something as leaders you really need to cultivate, what I say as, during times of peace as well as during war. You're not going to just conjure up authenticity when you need it. You certainly want to work on it during times that are not uncertain and not filled with crisis. So I'm not sure how many of you have seen the video that the CEO of Marriott released, but it has gone viral. And I think a big part of the reason why it's gone viral is for the authentic way in which he shows up. So Sorensen models authenticity in this video address to his employees, and I think it's notable for several reasons. First of all, his ability to share his strengths and his flaws. He says at the beginning of the video that he was actually hesitant to reach out to his employees in this way, to do a video message, because of his bald head, which is a result of the treatment he's receiving for cancer. He's changed physically from that full head of hair and that robust physical appearance that you see on the right-hand side. But he shows up for his people and he communicates with them, sharing both his strengths and his weaknesses, his flaws, in a way that conveys authenticity. And again, authenticity creates connection. He communicates it in his words and his tone. He says in the video, "I can tell you that I have never had a more difficult moment than this one. There is simply nothing worse than telling highly valued associates, people who are at the very heart of this company, that their roles are being impacted by events completely out of their control." And then finally, as he finishes his brief talk, his voice cracks. The emotion comes through. It's raw, it's genuine, and they don't edit it out. He comes across, he is authentic. So again, creating a message like this, being authentic, it's not going to work if, as a leader, you haven't walked the talk prior to this point. So while we're talking about steady communication for unsteady times, the truth is that communicating for competence and connection is critical during any time. Certainly the stakes are ratcheted up with what's going on right now. All right, communicating for connection means also communicating about and for community. This is not about being a solitary hero or heroine. Teamwork is needed now more than ever, and it's really unrealistic to think that you alone as a leader can get your people through crisis. So let them know that you need them. Share specific examples and stories of community that can illustrate how you need them or where others in the organizations have gone above and beyond. So what kind of stories am I talking about? It's the story of the Amazon worker who has been, wiping off packages that he's delivering to a child who has an autoimmune deficiency challenge. So stories like that become legend or that go viral and that really demonstrate how people are showing up in ways that are so powerful and how they're serving your clients, serving the community. It certainly lets them know that they're a part of this team and that you need them, your company needs them to be successful. And then the other one I want to point out is certainly this idea of continuing to create psychological safety. This is a topic that one of my colleagues is going to present on in just a couple of weeks, so I won't go into too much detail. But what I want to say is that, in times of uncertainty, it may be even harder for individuals to raise issues or concerns. And this idea that, gosh, we're in a crisis and so everybody just needs to get on board can stifle necessary input. And in a virtual environment, I think psychological safety can be even harder to create and requires greater intentionality. But my message here is don't let this fall by the wayside. Continue to find ways to help teams speak up and surface their thoughts and their ideas, because when they do, some powerful things can happen. So here's the example of community I want to offer. I'm spotlighting here Mass General, who within days of the virus escalating, started mobilizing their medical school students. And upon learning that their clinical clerkships would be temporarily suspended, the students formed COVID-19 virus medical response teams. They organized into 4 committees that are focused on education and activism. One of the students said, as our clinical expectations suddenly changed, we all felt this growing sense that we just can't be idle. So when leaders cultivate this connection, people willingly follow them. Moreover, they willingly take initiative to ensure that the organization is successful. And then finally, communicating for connection means reminding people of your shared purpose. Help them remember what they're working for as it relates to the goals of your organization and your customers, focusing on that mission and the impact that you have on your customers each and every day. remind them of the value of their contributions and that opportunity to accomplish goals despite this uncertainty and despite the obstacles. And then certainly express gratitude for what they're contributing. So what does this look like? What's my example here? Um, we're not lacking for examples of how leaders and others have rallied around something bigger than the virus and something bigger than themselves. My example here is not from politics or medicine. I think examples of shared purpose can come through in everyday heroes. So truck drivers and grocery store workers, essential employees who have to continue to do their job, sometimes at the expense of personal well-being. And when you read some of the articles and some of the things that they're saying, yes, it's their job and it's their livelihood, but they also connect to the larger purpose. They talk about feeding America and being a part of that. So Tyson Foods, actually one of the largest companies in the world, in keeping with this, they announced that they'll be paying about $60 million in bonuses to their frontline workers and truckers during the coronavirus pandemic. And what they said is, we're proud of how our team members have stepped up during this challenging time to make sure we continue fulfilling our critical mission of feeding people across America, right? He's not talking about trucking, and the truckers aren't talking about what I drive or what my job is. They're motivated by the shared purpose of feeding individuals across the country. So as we wrap up here, again, there's no more powerful tool in communication to express both competence and connection. During times of uncertainty, people want to know that you're a leader who can help sort through the chaos and clear a path forward, that you are able to remove those obstacles and allow them to be their best and support you as a team. So you'll be effective in helping them be their best if you're a human being first. If you connect with them on that personal level, build the foundation of trust that you really should be forging in your relationships ongoing. Communicate frequently, transparently, authentically, thoughtfully. And your ability to do so will help you stay connected to your team and help them stay motivated and contribute to your organization, even if the path is unclear. So even during times that are not as dramatic as this, these are relevant skills. This is a relevant framework. I think things just certainly ratchet up given what we're in right now and the circumstances surrounding the great uncertainty that we're dealing in. It's both. I talked about how connection certainly is a big differentiator, but you want to communicate for both competence and connection, right? For that rigor and that compassion that we've seen many leaders demonstrate. And work on communicating these during times of peace, as I say. Don't just simply try and conjure it up during times of crisis or times of war. It's not going to work. So certainly work on these skills during all of your interactions with your employees. Pre-COVID, hopefully you've been working on it. Post-COVID, and when this is hopefully the pain of this is a distant memory, you should still be working on building that competence and connection. So I think Maya Angelou really said it famously in this quote that, people will forget what you said, they'll forget what you did, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. And for me, this really is a barometer of successful communication, when you can help people feel understood, inspired, motivated. My hope really is that we communicate through this unsteady time and beyond as leaders, as human beings, that we communicate in a way that lifts each other's spirits while we simultaneously carve out a successful path going forward. And then finally, in the category of keeping it real, as I like to do, this is my reality. So I'm working from home with a 13-year-old and a 6-year-old and prepping for this webinar because I'm not with my colleagues other than via a virtual device. My 6-year-old is my audience. So he took notes, and he summarized it in this way: show your strengths because you can be a leader. And look, we're working on spelling. I'm homeschooling him, as many parents are doing. And he told me about a week ago, quote, "I'm the worst teacher ever." So, so there's much work for me to do with him. But this is my reality, and it's the reality of so many of us at this time. And while Colin is not here to take questions, I am, and I'm happy to do so. And as we move to that, I know that there were a lot of resources and articles that I referenced, We will make those available to you, certainly through this page. No need to take a picture. Some great resources that we've provided as an organization, and certainly others that we've curated have had some fantastic things to say, so we will share that with you. And then in the interest of time, Kayla, I know we have about 5 minutes, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Yes, thank you, Leah, for that very, very important discussion. We did have several questions come in. Thank you, everyone. You've been great in the chat. Keep them coming in. We'll try to get through as many as we can. I will say if we don't get to all of them, it may be a good opportunity for us to address them in a blog post we can send to you. So, as a reminder, if you have a question, go ahead and enter it into the Q&A module at this time. And obviously, we covered a lot in 45 minutes. There's still more to discuss. You can continue the conversation with Leah beyond today. Leah, if you go ahead and flip it to that last slide, we'll make sure everybody can see your contact information available. Also, I'd like to remind you that the recording and the slides from today will be emailed to the address that you provided when you registered, and you'll also have access to those links to the articles that she referenced. I will jump right into these questions. So, Leah, how do you see these elements of communication change in light of the fact that many leaders are virtual right now?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that is our reality. The best practices, I would say, don't change, but you need to have greater intentionality. So, be thoughtful about taking a pause when you're on the phone or in meetings with your team and check in with them. It can happen more organically in person. You can read body language, you can build rapport. It may not happen as naturally when you're communicating virtually. So find ways to bring it in. Keep it light. Bring in some humor, some playfulness. I've seen things like virtual happy hours are certainly a way to keep that connection with others. I've even seen, I can't remember where I read it, a leader who put some random object behind her in her office every day. And it's a bit of a place for her team to have some comic relief, a little playfulness in what she's placed behind her, who can spot it, what's the meaning. So, I think the best practices in terms of being a human being and communicating for competence and connection don't change. But we need to be a little bit more intentional and maybe a little bit more creative as leaders in how we ensure we keep that alive.
Wonderful. And I know several of you actually weighed in on this chat, but I wanted to give Leah a chance to respond. Going back when you were talking about urgency, someone said, what if you make a decision with urgency on imperfect information and it's the wrong decision?
Yeah, I think again, you need to cop to that, right? You need to be honest about it and share. This was the decision that I made at the time with the benefit of this information. Things are shifting and changing, and here's what I now know. And again, I think that it's unrealistic to expect that you'll be a perfect leader and make perfect decisions. And I think trying to sweep that under the rug and trying to do anything other than be clear and straightforward about it will only make a bad situation worse. So I would say certainly, address what has shifted and changed, why you made the decision you made at the time, and then work to, find a better path forward.
And the next question actually is something that I think about often, and it kind of goes back to even working virtually, because I think that this can be an issue when you're communicating via email or even IM. But how do you get around people filtering for what they want to hear?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So your intent in your communication may not be the impact, or the message might not be getting through. I think first of all, it's good to make sure that you're talking to your people regularly and getting a pulse from them on, what did they hear? How are you coming across? I think delivering a message and then sort of hunkering down behind your computer screen or in your office, you're not going to know the answer to that. So I think keeping the lines of communication open, certainly having, your trusted colleagues and people who will be honest with you that you can reach out to and hear from them whether or not the intent of what you're saying is coming across clearly. Because if you don't know that, you're not going to be able to address it. So I would say, certainly first find people who will be honest with you and forthcoming about whether or not your message is clear. And then if you learn that it's not, you need to clarify either in a group session or one-on-one, because certainly, I think this is stating the obvious. You don't want people running around with misinformation or the wrong perception. So find the people who can be straight with you. And if you learn that your message is not as clear as you intended, redouble your efforts to clarify.
So I want to be mindful of everybody's time. We have several questions that have come in. Go ahead and keep them coming in because we will address them. I'm going to go ahead and just take one more live on this call, and then we'll wrap it up. So this last one is around frequency. So how frequent is frequent? Can you share any ideas of what to share if you have no news to share with your teams? This person is trying to communicate to furloughed employees a few times a week, but is struggling with keeping it fresh and on point. Do you have any ideas you can share with us?
Yeah. So I think that's there's an art in that, not a science, right? So I can't say once a week or every other week. I think again, especially when your employees are not with you, I think you need to talk to them and have an intentional conversation about how often they want to hear from you or what would be helpful. Um, again, I think it's not a one size fits all approach. I think you need to take a pulse on what's right for the individual, take a pulse on what's right for your team and your organization, and then align to what you're hearing from your people is what they need from you. So don't guess. I think it's better to have an open and honest conversation about that topic than try and say that once a week is enough or every other week is enough. I just know that certainly long gaps of silence, we hear it from employees when they don't hear anything for a stretch of time, either in a video, an email, or in a one-to-one reach out, they start to fill in the blanks. So I would say, whatever your communication is now, ratchet it up a couple of notches, because when things are uncertain and you're not in front of them regularly, they'll start filling in the blanks with something that may be unintended.
Well, Leah, thank you so much for your time today, and thank you to everyone who joined us for your time and attention. I realized her contact information was not in the last slide, so I will send that in with the email follow up that we send you with the PDF of the slides and the link to the recording from today. And we'll also make sure you have the links to those resources, which I put up on your screen right now. Um, so, with that, we hope that you will join us again for our future webinars. We have several up on our site, and registration is available on our webinars page at gpstrategies.com. I wish everyone a wonderful and productive rest of your week. Stay healthy and stay safe.